20 years ago, on a cold October night, a quiet back road in Maine became the stage for an experience that still haunts me to this day. Halloween had always been my favorite holiday, with its macabre decorations and chilling ambience. But what I thought would be a moment of admiration for a beautifully crafted yard display turned into something far darker. The graveyard was hauntingly detailed, crooked gravestones with chilling inscriptions, skeletons clawing from shallow graves, and zombie hands reaching skyward. Severed limbs lay scattered amidst rats and bats, all shrouded in rolling fog. The darkened house behind it loomed like a silent sentinel, amplifying the unsettling stillness of the night. The silence was suddenly shattered, sharp and jarring. From behind a crooked gravestone, a figure exploded into view. My breath caught as the scene transformed in an instant, from hauntingly eerie to terrifyingly real. He was dressed in dirty overalls and a worn flannel shirt, his face obscured by a crude mask, a dirty pillowcase with jagged eye holes that seemed to gaze right through me. In his hands, he gripped a roaring chainsaw, its blade spinning violently, sending smoke and sparks into the chilly night air. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. I was frozen in my seat, the surreal moment overtaking every instinct. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was this part of the display? An overzealous Halloween enthusiast trying to scare passersby? But his speed, his energy, and the raw ferocity of his approach told me otherwise. This wasn't a prank. It felt primal, dangerous. The man moved with terrifying purpose, closing the distance between us faster than I could have imagined. His footsteps crunched against the frost-covered ground, each sound amplified by the silence that had consumed the world just moments ago. The chainsaw roared louder, a mechanical scream tearing through the still night. The sound of the chainsaw intensifies as the camera pans to the narrator gripping the steering wheel tightly, their knuckles white with fear. My hands fumbled on the wheel, panic making them clumsy. I struggled to comprehend what was happening. Everything in me screamed to run, to escape, but my body felt sluggish, as though fear itself had wrapped around me like chains. As the man grew closer, I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My foot slammed the accelerator, and the car jolted forward. The tires screeched against the pavement, the engine roaring as I sped away. But he didn't stop. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him chasing me, the chainsaw swinging at his side, his strides long and relentless. Cut to a low-angle shot of the man running in the mist, the chainsaw glinting in the dim light, his silhouette distorted and monstrous. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing louder than the chainsaw's roar. I couldn't believe what was happening. How could someone be so deranged, so dedicated to this horrifying act? I glanced in the mirror again. He was falling behind, but he wasn't slowing. His form was barely visible now, a shadow against the swirling fog. Finally, the distance between us grew too great. I watched as he stopped in the middle of the road, standing there motionless, the chainsaw still rumbling in his hands. Smoke rose from the blade, twisting like ghostly tendrils in the cold night air. He didn't follow me any further. He just stood there, watching the camera focuses on the chainsaw-wielding figure, framed by the thick fog and the dim glow of the lantern in the distance. That stillness, after such a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled moment, was the worst part. He didn't yell, didn't move. He simply stood there, his head tilted slightly as if savoring the fear he had caused. It was a sight I'll never forget. The figure of that man, illuminated by the faint light, framed by the eerie mist, burned into my memory. I kept driving, the scene replaying over and over in my mind. Every detail became sharper with each recollection. The gleam of the chainsaw, the ragged edges of his mask, the ferocity of his approach. But it was his stillness at the end, that unnerving pause in the chaos, that haunted me the most. Who was he, a deranged prankster? Someone taking Halloween far beyond its usual boundaries? Or was it something more sinister, something darker, that drove him to crouch behind that gravestone, waiting for a random car to pass by? The questions churned in my mind, each more unsettling than the last cut to close-up shots of the car speeding down the road, the narrator's hands trembling on the steering wheel. As I put more distance between myself and that house, doubt began to creep in. What if I hadn't driven off so quickly? What if I'd hesitated, or worse, gotten out of the car. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I pressed the accelerator even harder. Eventually, the road opened up into a more familiar stretch, the faint lights of civilization breaking through the oppressive darkness. I slowed down, the adrenaline still coursing through me, making my hands shake. But even as I left the scene far behind, the questions lingered. The camera pans back to the graveyard, now empty, the fog thickening as the sound of the chainsaw fades into the distance. Why would someone go to such lengths? The house itself had been dark, abandoned looking. There were no cars in the driveway, no signs of anyone else around. Had he been sitting there all night, crouched in the cold, waiting for someone to pass by? Did he do this every night, hoping to catch an unsuspecting victim? It wasn't just the act itself that unsettled me. It was the dedication, the sheer patience and precision required to wait in silence for someone to stop. And for what? A scare? Or was it something more malicious? Had I narrowly escaped a far worse fate? Disguised as a Halloween prank, the final shot lingers on the graveyard, now ominously silent. The fog swirls lazily around the gravestones, giving the scene an otherworldly feel. To this day, I don't have answers. All I have are memories. Memories of a man with a chainsaw, a mask that hid everything except his intent, and the chilling realization that I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere. Whatever his reason, I'm just grateful I didn't stick around to find out. The scene fades to black, with the faint sound of the chainsaw echoing as the screen goes silent. The car tore down the empty back road, the tires skidding slightly as I pushed the accelerator harder. My heart pounded against my ribs, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The engine roared in the still night, its sound swallowed by the endless fog that seemed to stretch forever. In the rearview mirror, his shadow lingered. At first, he was still running, his grotesque figure barely visible against the swirling mist. The chainsaw's roar mingled with the sound of my own engine, a chaotic symphony of fear and flight. I glanced back again. This time, he had stopped, cut to the figure standing in the road, the red taillights of the car illuminating his silhouette. He stands rigid, holding the roaring chainsaw at his side, smoke curling into the cold air. There he was, just standing in the middle of the road, as if rooted in place. The chainsaw hung in his hand, its blade still spinning, but he wasn't chasing anymore. He didn't need to. The sight of him, frozen in the mist, was enough to send a chill deeper than anything I'd felt before. What was he thinking as he stood there? Was he savoring the fear he'd created, watching his handiwork unfold as I sped away into the night? Or was he disappointed that he hadn't gotten closer, that I'd escaped? That unshakable stillness, that eerie pause in the pursuit, was almost worse than his initial attack. As the fog consumed him, he disappeared entirely from view, but his presence lingered. I couldn't stop glancing back, half expecting him to appear out of nowhere, the chainsaw roaring as he somehow caught up to me again. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, as if the night itself was conspiring against me. The road ahead seemed endless, a twisting path of fog and darkness. I wanted to feel safe, to believe the danger was behind me, but something deep inside wouldn't let me. My mind raced with questions, none of them comforting. Who was he? What kind of person waits in the dark like that, crouched in the cold, just to terrify someone? Was he just another Halloween fanatic, or was there something far more sinister about his intentions? I tried to focus on the road, to shake the lingering terror, but the questions wouldn't stop. What if I hadn't driven away fast enough? What if the car had stalled? Or worse, what if I had stepped out, thinking it was just a prank? The thought made my stomach churn, my breath catching in my throat. Eventually, the road straightened, and the faint lights of distant houses began to break through the darkness. The sight of them should have brought relief, but it didn't. My mind was still trapped back there, on that deserted road, with that man standing motionless in the mist. The memory clung to me like the fog itself, heavy and oppressive. Even as I put miles between myself and that graveyard, the image stayed with me. The chainsaw, the mask, the eerie dedication of it all. It felt like more than just a Halloween scare. It felt personal, as if he'd been waiting for me specifically, though I knew that wasn't possible. Or was it? I'll never know what drove him to such lengths, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unexplored. But even now, all these years later, the memory remains vivid. A chilling reminder of how thin the line between a prank and true danger can be. The graveyard remained as still and silent as before, a chilling testament to the night's events. The fog drifted lazily over the cracked gravestones, curling around the skeletal remains that clawed from the earth. The flickering lantern cast distorted shadows that seemed alive, stretching and shifting as if whispering secrets to the darkness. The macabre decorations were frozen in time. Severed limbs, broken coffins, and grotesque figures left in twisted poses. In the eerie quiet, the once impressive Halloween display now felt sinister, as though it had absorbed the terror of what had just transpired. The graveyard felt less like a scene of fun and more like a harbinger of something malevolent. I imagined him there, crouched behind the gravestone, waiting in the cold. How long had he been hiding, motionless, shrouded in mist, biding his time? The thought of such patience, such meticulous planning, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. He had no idea who might come down that desolate road, and yet he was ready, prepared to lunge into action at the first sign of a visitor. The house itself loomed in the background, as dark and lifeless as before. Its windows stared out like empty eye sockets, unblinking and hollow. A single lantern flickered faintly, the only light piercing the oppressive darkness. The house offered no answers, only deepened the mystery. Was it abandoned, or was it hiding its own secrets behind its decaying facade? Every detail of the scene felt deliberate, from the perfect placement of the gravestones to the unsettling realism of the decorations. It was too perfect, too meticulous to be anything less than the work of someone deeply committed, or deeply disturbed. Yet, what unnerved me most was how lifeless it now seemed, as if the energy had been drained from it the moment I drove away. Was this all a ploy for a scare, or was it something darker, something I had narrowly escaped without even realizing it? Was this man simply devoted to creating fear, or had his intentions gone far beyond a Halloween prank? The stillness of the scene provided no answers, only deepened my unease. I'll never know who he was or why he chose that place that night. The questions lingered in my mind long after I left, gnawing at me with each recollection. Was it luck that I had driven away in time, or had I been spared something far worse by mere chance? Those thoughts keep the memory alive, haunting and vivid. As the years have passed, the memory of that night hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper, more unsettling. I can still see the graveyard, still hear the faint hum of the lantern's light, still feel the weight of his gaze as I sped away. It wasn't just the scare that stayed with me. It was the profound, chilling realization of how close I might have come to something far more sinister.